Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling confused, heavy, maybe even hollow inside, but you couldn't quite explain why? The words sounded normal. The tone wasn't aggressive. There was no shouting, no obvious insult. And yet, something inside of you felt off, like your energy had been touched without permission. That feeling is not your imagination, it's your inner wisdom speaking. Because not all wounds come from fists. Some arrive gently, wrapped in sweet-sounding phrases. And not all protection involves armor. Sometimes, it's as simple as walking away from a sentence that doesn't belong in your spirit. In today's world, we are taught how to dress ourselves, feed ourselves, earn a living, even chase dreams. But no one teaches us how to guard our energy, how to listen to words, not just with our ears, but with our whole being. In the Zen tradition, there's a powerful teaching that often gets overlooked. Words carry the essence of intention. When someone speaks to you, they are not simply informing you. They are transferring their inner world into yours. And when you're not mindful of what you allow in, you risk carrying other people's chaos like it was your own. This is why we begin here. Before we speak of red flags or clever manipulations, we have to return to the core. What is the energy behind the words we hear every day? And more importantly, why have we stopped trusting ourselves to sense when something isn't right? Most of us were raised to be polite, to give the benefit of the doubt, to assume good intentions, to keep the peace, even at the cost of our own peace. We've learned how to rationalize discomfort, explain away confusion, and silence the small voice inside that whispers, "This doesn't feel right." But here's what the Buddha taught. Just as a snake sheds its skin, we must shed what no longer serves us. And sometimes, what no longer serves us is someone's voice echoing in our mind, a voice that tells us we're too emotional, too dramatic, too much. Let me be clear, words are not neutral, they are energy in motion. They either uplift your vibration or lower it. And when a person uses certain phrases, repeatedly, deliberately, and without care, they are not just talking to you. They are training you to question yourself, to second-guess your intuition, to feel guilty for having boundaries, to see your sensitivity as a flaw rather than the superpower it truly is. This isn't just poor communication. It's energetic warfare. And it's so subtle that most people don't even realize they've been wounded until years later, when they're rebuilding their self-worth from the ruins of someone else's words. In the monastery, a Zen master once told his student, "A sharp sword is feared, but the tongue, when used without wisdom, cuts deeper than steel." The student asked, "Then how do I protect myself from words that harm?" And the master replied, "By learning to recognize the intention before you hear the sound." That is the key, not reacting only to what is said, but sensing what is behind it, because manipulation rarely comes dressed as danger. It comes softly, quietly, like a whisper that gets inside your skin. This is where mindfulness becomes your shield, when you are grounded in your breath, rooted in your body, and deeply connected to your truth. You become less likely to internalize someone else's projections. You stop absorbing every comment as a personal evaluation, and you begin to ask, "Is this mine to carry? Now, why is this so important?" Because the words we internalize shape the lives we build. If someone convinces you that your needs are too much, you'll shrink yourself to fit their comfort zone. If someone tells you your emotions are dramatic, you'll bury your feelings just to keep peace. If someone insists they're just being honest, but that honesty leaves you aching, doubting, breaking, that's not clarity. That's cruelty dressed as candor. And if you don't learn to spot this pattern early, you'll begin to rewrite yourself, just to be tolerated. But what if you didn't have to keep doing that? What if you could trust that the way you feel is not a flaw? but a compass? What if you began to see that your sensitivity is not weakness, but wisdom? And what if, instead of second-guessing your instincts, you honored them? Because here's a truth most people won't tell you. The man who chooses you affects far more than your relationship. He impacts your energy, your health, your peace, your self-worth. He colors how you show up at work, how you speak to your friends, how you dream for your future. This is why the teachings of Zen don't just apply to monasteries. They belong here, in real life, in your boundaries, in your breath, in your everyday interactions, and especially in your choice to walk away when your soul whispers, "This isn't safe." There are 5 phrases you're about to hear. On the surface, they seem harmless, maybe even reasonable, but once you understand the true energy behind them, you'll never unhear them again. You'll start recognizing how certain words don't just communicate, they condition, and how the wrong ones can steal years from your spirit before you even realize what happened. But when you see it clearly, when you remember your worth, when you choose to protect your energy like it is sacred, because it is, that's when you begin to awaken. And that is exactly where we begin. Let's step into the first phrase, the one that sounds the most innocent, but carries the power to disconnect you from your deepest truth. You've probably heard it before. You're too sensitive. Let's see what it really means. They say you're too sensitive, as if that's a flaw. But maybe, just maybe, sensitivity is your superpower in disguise. Because after all, what if the very thing they mock is the deepest part of you? The part that sees clearly what others ignore, feels what others bury, and hears the silent cries that no one dares speak aloud. Let's go deeper. In a world that glorifies toughness, speed, and emotional numbness, sensitivity is often labeled as weakness. You might have heard it since you were a child. Stop crying over nothing. Don't take it so personally. You're too emotional. And slowly, word by word, the world conditions you to distrust your own radar. That radar is your intuition, that internal nudge, that quiet voice that says, something doesn't feel right here. But when you're told enough times that you're too sensitive, you begin to silence that voice. You begin to doubt it. You begin to shut it down. And here's the tragedy: when you shut it down, you don't just lose sensitivity. You lose clarity. You lose alignment. You lose the purest version of your truth. See, sensitivity is not just about reacting to emotions. It's about perception. It's about feeling the unspoken energy in a room before anyone says a word. It's about reading the air and reading people, and feeling shifts in energy like a sixth sense. And in the noise of the world, sensitivity is the very quality that keeps you connected to what's real. But the modern world wasn't built to honor that. It celebrates detachment, performance, and resilience, but not the resilience of feeling deeply and still choosing to remain open. No, it praises the kind that shuts down and gets over it fast. So let's question this. What if you're not too sensitive? What if you're just finally awake in a world that numbs itself to sleep? What if your sensitivity is your connection to truth? Imagine this. You're at a gathering. Everyone's smiling, laughing, playing their roles. But something inside you feels off. You can't explain it logically, but there's a tension under the surface. Maybe someone's words feel performative. Maybe the vibe feels fake. You say nothing, you stay quiet, you smile back. But deep down, your intuition is whispering, this is not right. You feel it in your gut, in your chest, in the subtle tension around your temples. That's your intuitive self speaking to you, not with logic, but with energy, with resonance. And that's where sensitivity becomes power. Because the intuitive self doesn't need proof. It knows. It senses. It picks up on frequencies that words haven't yet reached. But when society shames you for being too sensitive, it's not just asking you to ignore your emotions. It's training you to mistrust your truth. Let's be honest, this is how manipulation survives. Not just in relationships, but in culture, politics, media, even family. When people dismiss your sensitivity, they're not always trying to hurt you. Often they're trying to protect their own illusions. Your truth, your clarity, might make them uncomfortable. So they project discomfort back onto you, telling you that you're the problem. But remember this, the intuitive self only whispers. It doesn't shout. It waits for you to get quiet enough to hear it. And when you ignore it long enough, it doesn't go away, it just goes quiet. And that silence, it leaves you vulnerable to things you were meant to walk away from. Now here's what's powerful. When you stop apologizing for being sensitive, you begin to trust your energy. You begin to recognize when something's off, not because someone told you so, but because your inner compass felt the shift. And when you live in alignment with that compass, you no longer need validation. You just know. So here's the challenge. Unlearn the lie that sensitivity is weakness. Reclaim it as the language of intuition. When someone says you're too sensitive, hear it for what it truly is. I can't handle how deeply you feel. Or your awareness threatens my comfort zone. And that's okay. Not everyone is meant to understand your depth. Not everyone can. But you must never abandon it. Because the most dangerous thing you can do is silence the voice that's trying to protect you. That inner voice that senses red flags before the fall. That notices manipulation before it becomes trauma. That urges you to walk away even when everyone else says, just stay. This voice, your intuitive self, is not here to make life easy. It's here to make life true. So yes, protect your inner peace. But also protect the part of you that feels too much, sees too much, loves too much. Because that part of you is the realest part. The part that holds the map to your healing, the compass to your alignment, the wisdom that no one taught you but you always knew. And maybe, just maybe, that's not sensitivity, that's clarity. There's a sharp edge hidden behind the words. I'm just being honest. It sounds noble, doesn't it? As if truth is a sword that must always be swung no matter who it cuts. But here's what they don't say. Sometimes it's not honesty. It's cruelty, wrapped in the cloak of virtue. Have you ever walked away from a conversation, heart heavy, thoughts spinning, and someone shrugs? Hey, I was just being honest. As if that phrase somehow justifies the damage they left behind. As if truth by its very nature must hurt. But real truth, real honesty, it doesn't leave wounds, it offers clarity. It doesn't bruise your spirit, it gently awakens it. We live in a world where brutal opinions are celebrated as strength, where tactlessness is mistaken for authenticity, where people weaponize their honesty to tear others down, to dominate, to assert control, and expect applause for it. But here's a deeper truth. When someone delivers a truth without love, it isn't truth at all, it's a projection, an ego trip, an act of dominance disguised as moral high ground. You see, kindness and honesty are not opposites. They are companions, meant to walk hand in hand. Real honesty from a place of integrity considers the how, not just the what. It's aware of timing, tone, the emotional space of the person receiving it. Let me share with you a quiet moment from Zen tradition. There's a story about a young monk who asked his teacher a difficult question. The teacher didn't answer right away. He paused, observed, and then spoke a simple sentence, not to shame, not to elevate himself, but to gently guide. The student didn't feel exposed. He felt understood, and in that stillness he grew. That's what truth looks like when spoken with wisdom. Now ask yourself, how many times have you silenced your own truth because you feared it would come out sharp? Or worse, how many times have you allowed someone to pierce your peace in the name of just being honest? Here's what we often forget. You have the right to question why someone is sharing something with you. You have the right to examine their intention, not just their words. Is it for your growth or for their ego? Are they lifting you with truth or loading you with judgment? This chapter isn't about silencing honesty. It's about reclaiming it. It's about giving it back its dignity. Because truth without compassion is noise. And noise, no matter how loud, never leads to healing. You owe it to yourself to surround your life with voices that speak truth wrapped in care. People who understand that timing matters. That words carry energy. That honesty isn't a license to wound, it's a bridge to connection. And if you've been the one wielding honesty like a sword, pause, not to shame yourself, but to ask, what am I really trying to say? Is this about the truth, or about being right? Is this about helping, or about controlling? When your words are rooted in love, even the hardest truths feel like an offering, a gift, a hand on the shoulder, not a slap across the face. So the next time someone shrugs off their cruelty and hides behind the mask of just being honest, you'll know better, you'll feel it, because truth spoken without love is not your truth to carry. Let your heart hold space for truth that softens, not hardens. Let your voice be the kind that heals. Even when it's honest, it starts innocently. You say no, you ask for space, you request to be spoken to with respect. And then, suddenly, the air shifts. They look at you with a raised brow, their tone sharpening as they utter those 4 cutting words. You're being controlling. Let's pause here. Why does it sting so deeply? Because you know your heart. You know you weren't trying to dominate or manipulate. You were trying to protect your peace, your dignity, your emotional truth. But in a world where so many are allergic to boundaries, even the softest no can be weaponized. Let's dig deeper. There's a quiet war that unfolds every time someone confuses boundaries with control. It's a distortion, a psychological sleight of hand, meant to twist reality and make you question you. And if you're an empath, a healer, a deeply intuitive soul, this manipulation can slip in like fog under a door. It doesn't yell. It whispers, and its favorite disguise, guilt. Suddenly, your simple act of self-care is branded as selfish. Your clear communication becomes bossy. Your emotional truth, too intense. And your decision to walk away from what doesn't feel right. You're overreacting. But here's the truth. Healthy boundaries are not about controlling others. They're about protecting yourself. They are sacred markers, lines drawn not in anger but in love. Love for your peace. Love for your healing. Love for your becoming. There's a myth that boundary setters are cold, guarded, or aggressive. But the reality is, it takes immense courage to speak your needs. Especially when you've spent a lifetime trained to please, to appease, to stay quiet. And there will be people, sometimes even the ones you love the most, who will resist your growth. Not because your boundaries are wrong, but because your clarity confronts their chaos. Your centeredness threatens their control. Your peace, ironically, disrupts the dysfunction they've grown used to. And here's the kicker. They might not even know they're doing it. See, many people have never been taught to coexist with someone who has healthy limits. They've mistaken enmeshment for love, obedience for kindness, silence for respect. So when you stop abandoning yourself for the sake of keeping the peace, they feel unsettled, as if your autonomy is an act of aggression. It's not. It's an act of rebirth. Let's get real for a moment. There is nothing noble about shrinking. There is nothing spiritual about being a doormat. There is nothing enlightened about tolerating what breaks you. Saying this doesn't work for me is not controlling. Asking for mutual respect is not controlling. Walking away from a situation that drains your soul is not controlling. It's truth. It's sovereignty. It's love with your name on it. If someone labels your boundaries as control, ask yourself, are they used to you having no boundaries at all? Do they benefit from your silence, your people-pleasing, your overgiving? Do they expect access to your energy without accountability? Because here's a sacred truth. People who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always see your limits as a threat. But that's not your burden to carry. You don't need to prove your purity. You don't need to justify your peace. You don't need to shrink your soul to fit someone else's comfort zone. Let them misunderstand you. Let them twist your words. Let them call you names. Because your healing is not up for negotiation. And remember this. Every time you say no to chaos, you say yes to peace. Every time you enforce a boundary, you build a home within yourself. Every time you walk away from guilt-based control, you step closer to your highest self. So the next time someone tells you, you're being controlling, take a breath and feel into your truth. Ask yourself, am I trying to force their behavior, or am I protecting my own energy? There's a world of difference, and the moment you realize that, you'll stop defending your boundaries and start embodying them. Let's continue. Because there's a deeper force at play, one that cloaks emotional harm in the language of love. It's subtle, it's strategic, and it's time we expose it. They hold your hand. They call you every night. They open up to you about their deepest fears, and you feel the closeness, real, raw, magnetic. It seems like love, smells like connection, but then, just as your heart begins to trust, they say those 6 soul-wounding words. I'm not ready for a relationship. And just like that, the intimacy becomes a mirage, so close, yet utterly untouchable. You're left suspended in confusion, questioning everything. Was it all fake? Were you imagining the bond? But the truth is more unsettling. You weren't imagining the connection. What you were experiencing was intimacy without responsibility. You see, there's a modern epidemic of emotional consumers, people who crave the warmth of connection but not the weight of commitment. They want the emotional benefits of closeness without offering the structure, clarity, or care that true partnership requires. And the phrase, "I'm not ready for a relationship," has become their golden shield, a polite escape clause wrapped in self-awareness, when in reality, it often masks a deeper refusal to be accountable for another's heart. But here's what nobody tells you. You don't have to be in a labeled relationship to feel deeply responsible for someone's emotional well-being. And you also don't need to accept emotional crumbs just because the other person isn't ready. Let's unpack the illusion. When someone shares their traumas with you, when they seek comfort in your arms at 2 a.m., when they make you feel like you're the only one who gets them, it feels sacred, doesn't it? You tell yourself, maybe they're just scared. Maybe with time they'll see how good we are together. I'll be patient. I'll be the safe space they never had. And slowly, you build a home in someone who only meant to rent, not own. They never promised forever, but their actions whispered it. They never said, "I love you," but their presence echoed it. So when they say, "I'm not ready," you don't hear no, you hear not yet. And you wait and you wither. Because emotional intimacy without structure is like oxygen without a container, it dissipates. And here's where it gets dangerous. You start compromising your needs. You shrink your voice. You stop asking, "Where is this going?" Because you're afraid the answer will confirm your worst fears. You become a silent participant in your own heartbreak. You ignore your intuition, that wise inner voice that senses the imbalance. You convince yourself you're too much for wanting clarity. You confuse their vulnerability for capacity, when the two are not the same. Just because someone can open up doesn't mean they can show up. Just because someone feels deeply doesn't mean they can love responsibly. And this is where we must be radically honest with ourselves. Ask yourself, what is the difference between someone who's emotionally unavailable and someone who's just using intimacy as a form of comfort? Because sometimes people aren't not ready. They're very ready for affection, for connection, for validation. They just aren't ready for the accountability that comes with real love. And you deserve more than fragments. You deserve someone who doesn't just share their world with you, but invites you into it. You deserve someone who doesn't just say they care, but shows up consistently, especially when it's hard. You deserve someone who doesn't leave you guessing, who makes your place in their life undeniable. So here's the truth that sets you free. Someone saying, "I'm not ready," is not a mystery you need to solve. It's a decision you get to make. Do I stay in the illusion, or do I reclaim my reality? Because love isn't something you wait around for. It's something you co-create, with someone ready to build it with you. Now, this doesn't mean you have to hate or blame the person who couldn't meet you there. In fact, you can send them compassion. They showed you something powerful, your capacity to care, your depth, your heart. But that doesn't mean you should stay. Because loving someone is not the same as settling for what they can't give. And if your heart is being kept on a leash, if you're walking on emotional eggshells, holding space for someone who refuses to hold space for you, then maybe it's time you stop listening to their excuses and start honoring your own needs. Because your heart is not a waiting room, your soul is not a backup plan, and your love is not a consolation prize for the emotionally unavailable. When someone tells you they're not ready, believe them. And when you feel that familiar ache in your chest, the one that says, "But I thought this was real," gently remind yourself it was real for you, and that matters. But now it's time to choose someone who's not just willing to love you, but ready. And when you walk away from the illusion, when you finally let go of the almosts, the maybes, the not yets, you don't lose love. You make room for the kind of love that doesn't need to be questioned. The kind that feels like coming home, not to someone else, but to yourself. Let's keep going, because what comes next will open your eyes to how our very sense of self is shaped, twisted even, by the way others frame our reality. And it starts with just 4 words: "You're overreacting again." They say it like it's an accusation. You've changed. Not with admiration, not with curiosity, but with a subtle sting, as if your evolution was an act of betrayal. But let me ask you something. Were you supposed to stay the same forever? See, growth is one of the quietest rebellions you can commit. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It happens in the late-night realizations, in the silent decisions to no longer tolerate chaos, in the small steps away from what drains you, and toward what heals you. But the moment you begin to rise, someone will always feel like you've left them behind. And that's the thing. You haven't changed in a way that hurt them. You've changed in a way that no longer enables them. You're no longer the emotional dumping ground. You're no longer the people pleaser who sacrifices their own needs. You're no longer willing to shrink yourself just to keep someone else comfortable. And to those still trapped in their own cycles, that feels like abandonment. It feels like rejection, because your growth becomes a mirror that reflects back everything they haven't confronted yet. They don't say you've grown. They say you've changed. Because growth is a compliment, but change threatens the illusion of control. They liked you when you were easier to manage, when you didn't speak up, when your boundaries were soft, or better yet, invisible. They liked you when you said yes, even though your soul was screaming no. They liked you when you stayed small, but that version of you, she was breaking. She was silently suffering behind her smile. She was exhausted from performing peace while fighting internal wars. She was crying in bathrooms, apologizing for having needs, over-explaining just to feel understood. No, you didn't change. You returned to yourself, the real you, the one you buried under layers of approval-seeking, perfectionism, and fear. And now, because you've found your voice, because you've learned to say no, Because you've chosen self-respect over people-pleasing. They say you've changed, as if that's a bad thing. But here's the truth. Sometimes the people who claim to love you only love the version of you that serves their comfort. And when you evolve beyond that role, they feel betrayed. Not because you hurt them, but because they can no longer control how you love them. You stopped tolerating breadcrumbs and started asking for the whole meal. You stopped accepting excuses and started expecting effort. You stopped settling and started rising. And that scares people, because your growth demands that they either rise with you or be left behind. But don't dim your light just to keep others from squinting. Don't soften your roar to avoid waking the insecure. Don't apologize for evolving, because real love celebrates your growth. It doesn't resent it. If someone truly loved you, they would clap for your healing, not criticize the journey. They would recognize that growth means becoming the healthiest, truest version of yourself. And what could be more beautiful than that? The truth is, you're not too much. You're not cold for setting boundaries. You're not selfish for choosing peace. You're simply outgrowing dynamics that no longer match your frequency. And yes, that makes people uncomfortable. But you weren't born to make everyone comfortable. You were born to become who you really are. And sometimes that requires walking away from everything that only loved the unhealed you. So let them say it. Let them whisper behind your back, shake their heads, call you different, because you are. And thank God for that. You're not who you used to be. You're who you were always meant to become. And anyone who truly sees you will never fear your evolution. They'll be inspired by it. Growth doesn't need permission, it only needs truth. And the truth is, you didn't change. You remembered you came home. Now let's talk about what happens when someone says, "You deserve better," but never steps up to offer it. Because sometimes the kindest words can be a mask for the cruelest abandonment. Let's unravel that next. Sometimes harm doesn't scream, it whispers. It shows up in the spaces between words, in the shift of a gaze, in the way someone suddenly makes you feel unsure about your own instincts. This is not physical harm, nor the obvious sting of cruel words. This is energetic violence, and it's one of the most overlooked yet devastating forces in human relationships. Energetic violence is what happens when someone subtly undermines your reality, not with fists or insults, but with gaslighting, passive aggression, emotional withholding, and guilt. It's a form of manipulation so quiet, so clean, that the bruises don't show up on your body. They form inside your spirit. Have you ever left a conversation feeling drained, confused, or even ashamed, without being able to point to a single thing the other person did wrong? That's energetic violence. It distorts your perception of truth, of safety, and most of all of yourself. It often begins innocently. Someone raises an eyebrow when you speak. They go silent when you set a boundary. They make a comment, half joking, half barbed. "Wow, you're really emotional today." They laugh, you smile, but something inside you tightens. You start questioning. Was I too much? Am I being dramatic? Should I apologize? And that is exactly the trap. Energetic violence feeds on doubt. It thrives in relationships where control masquerades as concern and silence replaces accountability. The goal isn't to attack you outright. It's to destabilize you gently. So gently you might even believe it's love. This is how manipulators operate. They don't just twist your words, they twist your energy. And when you finally try to speak up, to name the harm, you're often met with more confusion. "I never said that." You're being sensitive again. You're making something out of nothing. You're left holding the weight of their behavior and the blame for reacting to it. Here's what no one tells you. Energetic violence is not always about what's done. Sometimes it's about what's withheld. affection that disappears the moment you disagree, support that vanishes the second you need it most, presence that only shows up when you're easy, agreeable, pleasing. This creates a haunting equation in your nervous system. If I make them uncomfortable, they'll abandon me. If I speak up, they'll disappear. If I stay silent, I'm safe. But silence is never safety. Silence is self-erasure. True connection doesn't require you to disappear. It welcomes your voice. It makes room for your edges, your feelings, your needs, even when they're inconvenient, especially when they're inconvenient. So how do you protect yourself from energetic violence? First, you listen to your body. Before your brain rationalizes, before your heart forgives, your body knows. It flinches, it closes. It feels tight, small, hesitant. Honor that signal. Trust it more than their excuses. Second, you name it. Not always aloud, but within yourself. I feel dismissed. I feel controlled. I feel punished for being honest. Naming the harm is the first step in reclaiming your power. Third, you protect your field. You are allowed to have energetic boundaries. You can leave conversations that confuse your spirit. You can step away from dynamics that leave you emotionally bankrupt. You can say, "This doesn't feel safe for me." And you don't need a dissertation to back that up. Your peace is proof enough. Energetic violence is a violation of the sacred, of your inner knowing, of your right to feel whole, seen, and safe. So many people are walking around carrying invisible wounds. From friendships that gaslit them, from families that silenced them, from lovers who trained them to doubt their own hearts. And still they smile, still they show up, still they love with a tenderness that deserves to be protected. If that's you, please hear this. You are not too sensitive. You are not too much. You are someone who feels deeply in a world that teaches numbness. You are someone who sees clearly in a world that rewards denial. And that, my friend, is not weakness. That is power. True healing begins the moment you stop negotiating your safety with people who treat your peace like it's optional. You are allowed to walk away from any space that confuses your spirit. You are allowed to choose clarity over chaos. You are allowed to protect your light, because the real violence is not the loudest voice in the room. It's the one that quietly convinces you to betray yourself. And you're not here to shrink, you're here to rise. Let's go deeper. Because sometimes, what hurts most isn't what people do, it's what they pretend not to do. And that leads us to the next quiet, soul-twisting reality: how manipulation can wear the mask of kindness. Let's talk about the soft cruelty of unspoken control. They told you being sensitive was a flaw. That crying too easily, feeling too deeply, or needing solitude to recharge were weaknesses you had to toughen up and grow out of. But what if everything they called too much was actually your gift? What if your sensitivity wasn't a burden to be hidden, but a compass pointing you to deeper truth? Because in a world addicted to noise, distraction, and emotional disconnection, it takes strength to feel. It takes wisdom to pause, to notice, to care. And the sensitive soul doesn't run from pain, they hold space for it. They don't shut down when the world gets loud, they tune into what others ignore. You see, sensitivity is not weakness. It is perception. It is awareness. It is the ability to walk into a room and sense the tension no one's naming. It is hearing the unsaid in someone's tone of voice, noticing the micro-expressions in a stranger's glance, or understanding when a friend says, "I'm fine," but their silence screams otherwise. This level of presence requires energy. This level of attunement is a form of sacred labor. But for too long, we've told the most attuned among us that they're broken. We've labeled their sensitivity as fragility. We've mistaken their intuition for overthinking. We've called their empathy a burden rather than a balm. But those with deep sensitivity often carry ancient wisdom. They feel things generations before them were too afraid to name. They sense the cracks in society's stories and have the courage to imagine something more whole. Their strength doesn't come from being loud. It comes from being true. So let's redefine what it means to be strong. True strength is the ability to stay soft in a hardened world. It's the courage to tell someone, "That hurt me," when silence would be easier. It's choosing compassion over sarcasm, gentleness over dominance, clarity over control. And when someone mocks your depth, saying you're too intense, too emotional, too sensitive, remember, they are not reacting to your weakness. They are confronting the mirror your presence holds up to them, because sensitivity shines light. It reveals what others spend lifetimes trying to bury, and not everyone is ready for that light. Not everyone has done the work to sit with their own pain. So when yours brushes up against theirs, it can feel like a threat. But don't shrink. Don't harden. Don't become what hurt you just to fit in with those still afraid of their own tenderness. Your softness is not a liability, it's a legacy. One this world desperately needs. And here's the most beautiful thing. Once you reclaim your sensitivity as a strength, you start to honor it in others. You stop measuring people by how loud they speak, how much they hustle, or how little they cry. Instead, you start listening to the quiet wisdom behind their words, the stories behind their silences, the power in their presence. You become a safe place, not just for others, but for yourself. And that truly is power. Now let's explore what happens when people fear that power. And how, sometimes, the very people who are most threatened by your light are the ones who once claimed to love you the most. There comes a point in every soul's journey when silence says more than words ever could. When the heaviness in your chest, the subtle drain in your energy, and the quiet ache in your intuition all whisper the same truth. It's time to walk away. But here's the paradox. We often cling hardest to the things that hurt us the most. We stay in rooms where our spirit is shrinking, in conversations that feel like slow poison, in relationships where we're constantly negotiating our worth. Not because we're weak, but because we've been taught that endurance is nobler than discernment. That walking away means failure. That letting go means giving up. But that's a lie. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is choose yourself. Walking away isn't abandonment, it's alignment. It's recognizing that you no longer vibrate at the same frequency as the chaos you once tolerated. It's honoring the evolution of your soul, even if others don't understand it. Especially when they don't understand it, people will say you've changed. And you have. You've stopped dancing for crumbs of affection. You've stopped shrinking so others feel big. You've stopped over-explaining your boundaries to those who were never listening. You've started listening to your own breath. You've started honoring your gut over their guilt. You've started protecting your peace like it's sacred, because it is. Letting go doesn't mean you hate them. It means you love yourself enough to stop abandoning your own needs. It means you trust that your soul deserves spaces where it can breathe deeply, laugh freely, cry openly, and heal honestly. The truth is, not everyone gets to go with you. Not everyone you love is meant to stay. Not every chapter has a tidy ending. Sometimes the closure is you walking away with grace instead of rage. And you'll be tempted to explain, to prove that your decision was justified, that your pain was real, that your heart wasn't cold. But wisdom doesn't argue. Wisdom doesn't beg to be understood. Wisdom walks quietly, bravely, with tears in her eyes and fire in her spine. Because letting go isn't weakness, it's power. The kind of power that says, I deserve love without conditions. I deserve peace without apology. I deserve truth, not performance. And if that truth means walking alone for a while, so be it. Your soul will thank you. Your future self will thank you. And one day you'll look back, not with regret, but with reverence, because you'll know. The moment you chose to walk away wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. A homecoming to yourself, to your worth, to your wisdom. And now, in this quiet, sacred space you've cleared, comes the final truth, waiting to be remembered. At the end of all the letting go, all the inner battles, all the quiet revolutions within your heart, there remains one truth that shines brighter than pain, louder than fear, and softer than all the noise. True love honors growth. Not the kind of love that clings in desperation. Not the love that chains itself to a version of you frozen in time, but the love that breathes, stretches, expands, just as you do. We've been conditioned to think love means holding on. But real love doesn't imprison, it liberates. Real love watches you change and says, I see you becoming and I honor that. It doesn't shame you for evolving. It doesn't guilt you for choosing yourself. It doesn't resist your expansion just because it's unfamiliar. True love isn't afraid of your light. It doesn't ask you to dim it. It stands beside you in your becoming and says, shine brighter. In this life, you will outgrow people, places, patterns, even parts of yourself. But what's meant for your soul will never demand that you stay small to stay loved. The right people, the true ones, will cheer for your healing. They won't feel threatened by your strength. They won't mock your sensitivity. They won't shrink in the presence of your peace. Because love, when it's pure, becomes a sacred witness to your growth. Sometimes that love walks beside you for a lifetime. Sometimes it appears briefly, just long enough to awaken something vital within you. And sometimes that love is you, coming home to yourself after years of searching for safety in others. So if you've walked away, if you've drawn boundaries, if you've chosen stillness over chaos, solitude over performance, clarity over comfort, know this: you have not lost love. You've returned to it. You've peeled away the illusions. You've stripped down to truth. And now you stand here, braver, softer, wiser. Not because someone else validated your journey, but because you dared to walk it. True love honors growth, even when that growth means change. Even when it means distance. Even when it means walking alone for a while, trusting that something deeper, fuller, more aligned is waiting on the other side. Let this be your new compass. If it costs you your peace, it's not love. If it punishes your truth, it's not love. If it fears your evolution, it's not love. But if it sees you, supports you, grows with you, that is love, that is home, that is truth. So walk boldly in your becoming. You are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You are not too complicated. You are a soul in motion, rising, healing, shedding, expanding. And somewhere in this vast universe, someone or something, perhaps even your own future self, is whispering, I'm proud of you. I've been waiting for you. Keep going. You're not just surviving anymore. You're becoming, you're free, you're love, and you're finally home.